It's evident in your spirits, it's evident in your facilities, as God continues to move in this place to open up more of your future and the ways that you're going to be the people of God in this corner of Morganton. In 1961, a young Scottish mother named Sheila Burnford wrote what would become a beloved children's story called The Incredible Journey. It's the story of one Siamese cat and two dogs, an old English bull terrier and a young Labrador retriever that travel hundreds of miles in the Canadian wilderness in order to return home to their human family. Soon after the trio of animals set out, the narrator captures the thoughts, the feelings of the Labrador. Only one thing was clear and certain, that at all costs, he was going home. And home lay to the west. His instincts guided him. But he could not leave the other two. So somehow, he must take them with him all the way. The journey home. From my experience, the gospel imperative of forgiveness is very much a journey home. I want to talk with you this morning about our vocation as disciples of Jesus to forgive. I want to explore the surrounding context of the parable from the Gospel of Matthew as a foundation for God's mission of forgiveness in the world. You see, I have come to learn that in the end, forgiveness is all about returning to the heart of God. It is both a practice and a way of being that we journey into the wilderness our whole lives long. And this journey draws us closer to our identity of who we are and whose we are. So the background of this vignette in the 18th chapter of Matthew is that the whole of the chapter is a response to the disciples' question to Jesus of, who is the greatest? All of the verses leading up to this parable sets out in very broad strokes what it means to be followers of Jesus and members of the household of God. So as disciples, this question is symbolic of the values of the world. Who is most valuable? Who is better than? therefore wins the prize, if you will, of power and entitlement. In contrast, Jesus lays a foundation of God's kingdom, values, and the beloved community. To recap Jesus' teachings for the first 20 verses, the foundation is characterized by humility. Be like the children that Jesus is gathering around him, full of unpretentious wonder. Let humility and wonder lead to hospitality. Let humility lead to welcome for all of God's children. Let humility inhibit the capacity to shame or demean or persecute any child, but rather let humility expand every effort to bring back, to liberate, to protect. For Jesus, the grace of humility calls us to remember who we are and whose we are. As people who say yes to God, who say yes to Jesus, our identity is first, last, and always as disciples. Our identity, first, last, and always, is to be people of the way of love. And before we belong to any club, or town, or sports team, or ideologies, we belong to God. Our sense of being and purpose is inextricably connected to the mission of Jesus and the nature, the character, of the author of all life. Jesus came to restore humanity to wholeness and to reconcile all people back into life-giving relationships with God, back into life-giving relationships with each other, and back into life-giving relationships with ourselves. God's instinct is to move toward relationship, is to move toward wholeness, is to move toward healing. And that is the essence of salvation. And still, after all of that teaching, along comes Peter, and the question he poses to Jesus, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Now, honestly, we need to give Peter a little bit of credit for his faithfulness. 7 times is actually a very religious response. And in fact, it's also a very generous response. 7 was a number that hinted at eternity. In Peter's mind, and those who were listening to him, to forgive someone 7 times is being incredibly gracious and compassionate. But Jesus takes what is religious and he expands it. He expands the forgiveness of God well beyond 7 into the realms of incalculable extravagance. In 2006, gunman Charlie Roberts barricaded himself inside a one-room Amish schoolhouse near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And then he opened fire. And Roberts killed 5 children, injuring 5 others before he killed himself. Charlie's parents lived in that Lancaster community, but were English, as the Amish like to call non-believers. And the Roberts, understandably, were horrified, devastated by what their son had done, and they were grief-stricken that he was dead. Several days after the killings, the Roberts had a very private funeral for their son, but as they were standing at the graveside, they looked up and they saw as many 40 Amish start coming to walk towards them. And they surrounded the parents of the crescent. In an interview 10 years after that horrific day, Charlie's mother recalled that graveside moment, and she said, "Love just seemed to emanate from them." Sometime after the funeral, Mrs. Roberts humbly asked the parents of one of the children who survived but was severely injured if she could help take care of the little girl. So even though the child had recovered, she would never walk again, confined to a wheelchair, and being tube-fed. Once a week, for over a decade, Mrs. Roberts would go and gently care for that girl. Mrs. Roberts shared, "I will never forget the devastation caused by my son. But the other night, one of the fathers said to me, 'None of us would have chosen this, but the relationships we have built through it are priceless and sacred.'" Mrs. Roberts reflected further. Their choice to allow life to move forward was healing and sacred. To be honest, as a mother of 4 children, all under the age of 18, I don't know if I could have been that generous and that gracious and that loving and that forgiving like those Amish parents. But here's the thing. Jesus knew the journey of forgiveness would never be easy. In the horror and the depth of anguish, our human instinct is rage and riot. When we are flooded with grief and pain and loss and brokenness, human nature is to strike back and to harm those who have caused us harm, to seek vengeance, because we've been told it's going to make us feel. We've been told that's what's going to heal us. I believe Jesus intimately and personally knew this. Jesus also knew that unattended grief and anger, more often than not, leads to more loss and more tragedy and more death. I've come to learn, as I study and pray the words of Jesus, that forgiveness is much, much more than simply turning the other cheek, or letting bygones be bygones, or simply being nice and civil in the face of evil and injustice. Forgiveness is definitely not letting abusers continue their abuse. It seems to me that Jesus is saying this. Forgiveness is something that we will spend our whole lives attending to. We will stumble and we will fail. Jesus calls us to get up and get back on the path of walking toward it. The journey of forgiveness will always begin with the imperative of speaking truth, to name what is broken and wounded. Because more often than not, what we discover is that it's relationships that have been damaged. Trust has been shattered or taken advantage of. A life is tragically and unnecessarily lost. And love is forsaken. And humanity is silenced. As disciples, if we have been harmed, we are called to name our truth. And as disciples, if we've done the same, we are called to listen deeply. This phase of the journey requires incredible vulnerability and accountability. Remember, the journey before us is ultimately about returning to the heart of God, of being made whole, and being restored as children of God. Forgiveness calls us to take the risk of being open, to learn about what is broken, and to act to redeem life and relationships. For some of us, forgiveness will call us to let go and to let God. This doesn't mean we forget. It simply means that we let God be God. For some of us, forgiveness calls us to let God in and stir us to be healed. And to go out and make a change of heart, to make a change of habit, and then to change the world. Jesus said to Peter, not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. My friends, as disciples following Christ, the journey of forgiveness leads us home, where our lives and our souls are restored, renewed, and reconciled. Most certainly, the journey will never be easy. And often, forgiveness will never feel complete this side of the kingdom. But truly, as Jesus himself proclaimed as he hung from the cross, forgiveness is the way of God's salvation. Forgiveness is the way of God.